Greetings and salutations, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Man vs. Code. First off, my apologies. Life's been getting pretty crazy, and so you haven't seen me for a few weeks. I promised myself I was going to push out another video this weekend. Here we are. This one's all about authentication. We're going to be using AWS Amplify Authenticator to wrap our app in authentication. We're going to be using the AWS Amplify React UI components to render a sign-up modal, a login modal. We're going to be using the Bulma UI modal element. There's going to be a lot of hooks. We're going to use useContext to manage global state as to whether users logged in or logged out. There's going to be a lot of reducer hooks for managing the toggle state of the modal. Finally, we're going to create a wrapper, an authenticated wrapper, so that we can easily secure parts of our website. So it's going to be fun. Hope you enjoy it. Let's go smash out some code. In the third video, I ran through how to add Amplify with apps in GraphQL. So if you haven't done that yet, please go back and do so. We are going to be continuing on with AWS Amplify here, so you'll need to have that all installed and set up. The first thing I want to do is actually update Amplify. There have been some recent updates to the Amplify CLI. So the way you're going to do that is just run npm install global AWS-amplify/CLI. I'm not going to hit enter because I've already done that. But if you run through that and then run amplify-v to check your version, you should be up to version 4.0. The next thing I want to do is actually add the latest version of all the Amplify packages within our project. So within your project directory, and now we're up to directory number 5. So if you pull the latest repo from the GitHub, you'll have the complete code in folder 5. If you want to continue on and code along yourself, continue on from the end of folder number 4. So let's update our Amplify packages within our project and just say yarn add AWS Amplify at next. And so now we can very easily add authentication capabilities to our app with AWS Amplify by simply going amplify add auth and answering the questions. Default configuration, yes, let's go with that. Sign in with our username. Any advanced settings? No, we're done. And it really is as simple as that. If we run amplify push, it will push our changes to the cloud. And that really should only take a few minutes. Cool, so now, a few things to note. When we add the Authenticator Amplify React UI elements to our page, the console will throw an error and Next.js application will indeed crap itself. The error seems to be related to not being able to compile post CSS in an Amplify UI component within the node modules directory. And the error looks something like this. So this is a known issue, but thankfully, ladies and gentlemen, I have the fix for you. This is what you need to do to resolve this. So first of all, we need to yarn add the post CSS loader. Now we just need to pop back into our nextconfig.js, and we really need to change the way this is configured a little bit, including how we pass plugins here. I've just changed that around, told it to make sure that any CSS files, we use the post CSS loader to resolve that. And I've added this little section here, which is also going to prevent that nasty error from being thrown. So popping all this into your nextconfig.js, that will now correctly load all the styles in the AWS Authenticator UI components. And of course, the other thing we need to do is add the actual Amplify React component that we're going to create bindings from. So let's do that. AWS Amplify React. Next thing we're going to do is add a user folder inside our components directory, and within that there are a couple of files. So this is where we're creating a user provider which will wrap our component in. This uses a user context to manage global state of our application, determining when a user is logged in or not. and we'll then be able to access this state from anywhere in our application. We've defined a couple of types here, the actual user state itself to say whether a user is a guest or is authenticated, and user actions, which will then be able to dispatch depending on the situation of whether a user's logged in or logged out. Now, I'm not going to run through this in detail, but I will link to a blog, which I do recommend you go have a look at, which explains this in detail below. So please check out that blog to get a better understanding of what's going on with the user use context hook that's been created here. We'll leverage this, but I'm not going to run through that. Okay, next thing is to add some bindings to a couple of Amplify components that we're going to need. So I ran through bindings in the first video, creating bindings to Next.js components. If you want to revisit that, please do so. I will just quickly run through adding some bindings now to the Amplify components. We're going to call this amplify.re, and we need two components from this. We need the authenticator, bs.module. Now this specifies the name of the npm package that we're pulling from. React.component decorator. And the actual arguments or props that it takes. Which is Boolean, optional, and a method for on-state change, which we're going to make that abstract. And the actual children React elements that will be passed in. This actually takes, this component takes a lot more props than this. However, I'm only going to include this in the binding because these are really the only ones that I'm going to use in this video. And here we specify what we actually want to import from that package. It's the equivalent of using import curly brackets from whatever package. The next component we'll need is called the sign-in component from inside that package. It's the same package that we're pulling from. Oops, don't forget that. This doesn't take any arguments, but will return a React element. Now that we've created our Amplify bindings, I'm going to create just a generic modal, which I will place inside the layout directory. This modal is going to render whatever child React component that we pass through to it. There's nothing spectacular going on here. It uses Bulma UI elements. If you haven't checked out episode 2, where we talk about using bs-css with Bulma, please go back and do that if you want to go into a little bit of a deeper dive with using bs-css, together with Bulma. But essentially what we've done here is we've defined a React component. It takes a few arguments, is active, whether the modal is open or closed. The close modal method, which will be triggered when we hit this little button in the top right hand corner to close the modal. And of course the children that we want to render inside the modal. Nothing spectacular going on there. I'm going to create a new folder called navbar, and all navbar related things, I'm just going to pop them into that folder to keep them all nice together and neat. This isn't going to affect other parts of the application because, again, one of the great things about ReasonML, ReasonReact is that you don't need to import modules. It knows where they are. It just resolves them automatically. So it doesn't matter what folder you move things to. It doesn't you won't have to change any import statements throughout other parts of the application. Inside this folder, the first thing we're going to create is our sign-in modal. Okay, and it's going to be a React component. Define our make function. It's going to take a number of arguments, so is active, boolean. It's going to take the close modal method. And this is going to be appear as one of two types of modals, either a sign-in modal or a sign-up modal, which has a few different fields in it. So let's pass in that flag. As a default, we'll make it false. And this is where we use the useContext use user hook. Geez, that's a mouthful, that we created earlier. Again, we're trying to access that global user state, and we're going to change that global user state depending on what we get back from the Amplify authenticator. And then we're going to use the modal that we just created. We're going to pass in the isActive state that's being passed into this component, and the close modal method. So we're going to display if it is a sign up modal, then we'll display one thing. If it's not, then we'll display something else. So this is where we're actually going to use the authenticator binding package that we created the binding to a moment ago. So on state change, what do we want to happen there? On state change, when that gets called, it's actually going to give us a couple of values. One is the auth state, which is a string, and I'll show you how we're going to handle that. The string will either say sign in, which means that the user is not logged in, or it'll say signed in, which means that the user is logged in. So depending on what their state is, we're going to then set the global user state based on that, if that makes any sense. So what do we want it to do? Well, we want to take those values, useContext, and handle state change. Actually, I'm just going to call this dispatch user action, just to be a little bit more readable. So just a little note on this this handle state change method that we've called here. I defined this inside our useContext file, and you can see what that does. It's passing in the auth state that is coming back from the Amplify authenticator component, and switching and dispatching a couple of different things depending on what that auth state is. So we also pass in the dispatch user action. So if the auth state is, as I mentioned, it's a string, it can either be sign in, which means the user is logged out, And in that case, we're going to dispatch the user logged out action that we defined in user types, or if the user is signed in, then we'll dispatch the user types.user logged in. And these two states will again be accessible globally from throughout our application, as long as we wrap that application in the user provider, which we'll also do in a moment. So coming back to our sign-in modal, so that's what we display if it is a sign-in modal. Otherwise, the alternative is if it's a sign-up. That's what we display if it's a sign-up modal. The alternative is if it's a sign-in modal. I'm just going to copy that because it's almost identical. The only difference is that we say hide default equals true. And there will be a child there will be a child, which is the other component we created a binding into, the sign-in one. So the default UI component that Amplify actually displays will be the sign-up one. And you'll see what that looks like in a moment. If we say hide the default and we pass in what we want it to display, the sign-in one is just missing a few things. And I can see that the compiler is complaining about something here. Okay, I think I can see the problem, and yep, a bit of a typo inside our amplify.re file. That should fix things. Okay, yep, and we're Gucci. It is giving us a warning saying that we're not using auth data. We're not going to use it in this video. We might later on. What this does is it actually returns some of the details of the user that's logged in. For the moment, we just want to know the actual auth state, whether the user is signed in or not. So the next thing I'd like to do is create a sign out button. So what's going to happen is if the user is signed in, we want to display that sign out button. If the user's a guest, then we're going to display both a sign up and a login button. So let's create the sign out button now. So we want to access the auth object inside the AWS Amplify library. Let's do that now. Oops. It's a JavaScript type. This is the bit that we want, auth. And within that, we want to access the sign out method. So now we can actually include our React component, which takes a close modal method just to make sure that the modal stays closed when the user signs out. And all that's happening here is that when the user clicks the sign out button, it's going to call this method from inside the AWS Amplify package that we imported above to sign out the user. It's going to make sure that the modal doesn't open, and that's about it. Pretty straightforward. Now we can create our navbar sign-in button. So inside here, we're going to manage a few states. So this is where the user is going to click login or sign up, and that's what's going to toggle the sign-in modal that we just created, the sign-in or the sign-up modal. So we need to define our state, which will, there's two possible states, either the sign-in modal is active, or the sign-up modal is active, just depending on which button the user's actually clicked on. And there's a few different types of actions that we'll be able to dispatch. One is to toggle the sign in modal. The other is, yep, you guessed it, to toggle the sign up modal. And the other is to close modal, whichever modal just happens to be open at any point in time. That's a method you'll see we'll pass into some the other components that we just created. We also want to define our reducer. Take state and the action which we want to dispatch. And we're going to handle whichever action that is. So the first one will be toggle sign in modal. If that happens, then we're going to set the type sign in modal is active to the opposite of what its current state is. And we're going to make sure that the sign up modal is not active. Similar deal with the toggle sign up modal. And then finally with the close modal, we just want to make sure that everything is, all of the modals are not active. The compiler seems to have picked up a problem. And, oh yes, silly me. We're not using equal signs there, we're using the colon. That's a bit better. And now that we've done that, we can actually define our React component. So once again, we're going to make use of the useUser hook that we created earlier to get our current user logged in state and dispatch any actions related to that user. This is where we can define what happens in relation to our modal. Use reducer and pass in the reducer method that we just defined, and we pass in the initial state. So everything essentially is inactive. And inside this, this is where we'll actually define what our buttons look like. Okay, inside here, we're going to display two different things depending on whether our user is signed in or not. So this is where we have our switch statement. Oops. So if the user is a guest, i.e. not logged in, then we're going to display the sign up and login buttons. If they click, so this is the sign up button, and what do we want them to do when they click that? Well, we want to dispatch modal action toggle sign up modal. So if they click that, the sign up modal is going to appear magically. And we also want to display the login button alongside it. So the only thing we're going to change there is instead of dispatching the sign up modal, we'll dispatch the sign in modal, and the text will be of that button will be log in. And I'd like to actually put a different color on that. So let's go is light. These are actually Bulma directives. Is warning, is light. That'll affect the color of the button that we display, as you'll see in a moment. And of course, we need to actually display the modals that we want to use. So the first one is sign in modal is active. Well, that's going to be determined by the state. And the close modal method that we want to pass through to it. And of course, we also want to have our sign up modal as well. The only difference there is that we're going to pass in a flag to say is sign up modal. Yes, it is. And of course, the other state that we need to handle is when the user is actually authenticated. So in that instance, we just want to display the sign out button that we created and pass in the close modal function. Dispatch modal action, close modal. Now the compiler is complaining about something up here. It is saying that it's found a bug for us. There's been an error running the reasons parser on a file, and it should be around here. So let's have a look at what's wrong. Oh, and yep, silly me. I see what that is. I've closed off that div there. That should not be there. The other thing we want to do is, of course, export our make function. And actually what we should do is create our own style for the anchor tag, because otherwise it will inherit the parent's anchor tag style, which is white. And this modal is going to have a white background. So we want to make sure that the link appearing inside that modal is visible. So I covered in episode 2 how we deal with bs-css and styling. So here we just defined our link as gray inside this module, and now we can just use that in the actual anchor tags here. Navbar item or anything, any anchor tag under here is going to appear as gray. That should be navbar with a smaller case b. Okay, so before we run our application, there's still a few things we need to do. Hop over to our _app.js page. We need to import Amplify. We need to import our config. And then we need to set our configure Amplify with our config. So this just needs to be done once in the entry point of the application. And I'm going to go jump over to our page template file, which we created in video 2, if memory serves me correctly, page.re. And this is where we need to wrap our whole application in the user provider that we created earlier. So I want to access the user types. I also want to define a reducer method. Oh, sorry, actually, let's also set our state equals user from user types. Let's define a reducer method. It's really the action that we need from that. And let's switch potential actions will be user has logged in which case we're going to set the user state to authenticated. User is logged out, in which case we'll set the user to be a guest. And this is where we will actually use that reducer method. And set an initial state of guest. Next, we wrap our whole application in the user provider, which takes an argument of value, the state which the user is currently in, and the dispatch method. Now from here, we actually should be able to run our application and see the buttons and modals that we created. Okay, let's refresh this. And it's not there, and the reason why it's not there is because we actually still need to add it to our navbar. So over to our navbar, and the very last of these navbar items will be our sign in button. And yep, there's our sign up and login buttons. Should be able to click to toggle those. Lovely. We can click the create account user and fill that in and actually create account. I'll do that now. So you can see it actually has sent me an email and it's asked me for a confirmation code. So I'll just check my email and pop that in. Okay, got the code, hit confirm. And now it's taken me back to the sign in. I should be able to actually sign into my account. Sign in. It's closed the modal for me. And now we have the sign out button. Excelente. So I should be able to click this and I will be signed out. And we now see the sign up and login buttons. So one more thing I actually want to do is create a authenticated wrapper, because now that we know what state the user is, whether they're logged in or logged out, we can then create a wrapper for sections of our website that we only want authenticated users to be able to access. So let's do one now. Okay, so back to our project. Inside the source directory under components and user, I want to create a new file there. Let's call this authenticated. And this is going to be our wrapper. Open user type, so we have access to our state, our user state and user actions. I'm going to define a React component. Define our make function. We're going to pass it the children React component that we want to render only if the user is authenticated. And if the user is not authenticated, then we're going to tell them to bugger off. Not in those exact terms. Maybe we'll be a little bit more diplomatic about it. Maybe a 403. They won't know what, most people won't know what that means, but we will. And that's all that matters. equals user context. So again, we're just using our user hook that we created earlier. I do implore you to check out that blog that I'm linking below about this use context and use user provider stuff, because it's pretty good at explaining all this stuff. And as I said before, I haven't run through that in this video because she does a great job of it already. Switch the actual user state. Oops, let's pop that. So again, we'll either have guest, and if it is guest, let's just render a new section. We've created this in previous videos. The title will be 403 unauthorized. If they are an authenticated user, then let's render the children that get passed to it. And of course we need to export. Cool. Now let's actually create an authenticated route. Back into the pages directory, I'm just going to create a file called test authenticated, and that will be a React component. Let define our make function, not getting any arguments. And we're just going to go, let's close it off here. And if it is an authenticated user, just give it a title. I am authenticated. Okay, let's go back to our app. So if we try this route, we get unauthorized. However, if we log in, we should see the authenticated message. If we sign out, it should go back to the 403 unauthorized. Fantastic. So there you have it, gang. That's how you add authentication to a ReasonReact Next.js application using AWS Amplify. Really easy to do. Hope you enjoyed that video. If you do, you know the drill. Give it a thumbs up. Leave a comment and let me know what you think of it. Let me know what you want me to cover in future videos. I believe the plan for the next one will be to actually create a form using ReasonReact, so that we can and using a GraphQL mutation to create a post. But yeah, we have a whole series of these things coming. We want to create a full end-to-end application using ReasonReact Next.js and AWS Amplify with GraphQL. Once again, hope you enjoyed it. See you in the next video. Thanks again for watching.